A small mountain town was dying of thirst. Families queuing at dry wells, children crying for a single sip, crops turning to dust. No one believed hope could come from a homeless girl and the German shepherd who never left her side. But one bitter winter night, as the wind howled through Maple Hollow, the dog pulled her toward an abandoned cabin. What they uncovered inside would not only expose a terrible betrayal, but also save an entire town from ruin. If you've ever wondered whether the most unlikely souls can change the fate of many, this story will answer you. Where are you listening from tonight? Share your city below, and stay with me until the very end. Snow pressed against Maple Hollow like a heavy hand. The small Montana town, cupped in the valley of dark ridges, had grown accustomed to winters that bit and gnawed, but this year the cold came with another punishment. 4 months without rain had hollowed the wells, cracked the fields, and turned conversations into whispers about thirst. Even in homes where fire burned bright, cups were rationed like gold. The silence of need had settled on everyone. At the edge of Main Street, hidden behind an abandoned feed store, a 9-year-old girl named Sophie Miller folded herself into the husk of a hayloft. The wooden boards, cracked and softened by age, kept out some of the wind, but not all. Sophie was small even for her years, thin in the way that hunger carves away roundness and leaves behind only lines. Her brown hair hung in uneven tangles across her forehead, strands dulled by dust. Her face was narrow, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes gray-green, flecked like stone under a river, carried the weight of watching more than any child should. Her clothing spoke of survival rather than comfort. A man's jacket far too large, sleeves rolled twice but still dangling over her hands. A sweater unraveling at the hem, patched jeans with the knees worn white, boots taken from a donation bin, stuffed with newspaper to fit. Every movement carried the quiet of someone who had learned not to take up space, as though invisibility was her shield. Beside her, curled in the straw, lay Bruno. He was a German shepherd, 6 years old, with the strong build of his breed, but the leanness of an animal that had traveled too far without enough food. His coat, black and tan, was dulled in places yet still thick enough to protect him from the worst of the cold. One ear bore a notch from some forgotten fight, and his tail wagged only when he chose, not carelessly. His eyes, amber and deep, held the patience of a sentinel and the tenderness of a companion who had chosen his human once and for all. Together, they survived the winter nights, Sophie pressing against Bruno's flank for warmth, Bruno stretching his body to shield her from drafts that crept through the planks. Their breaths mingled, steam rising like small prayers in the dark. Sophie knew the townspeople by sight, if not by name. She knew Mabel, the diner owner, short and broad-shouldered, with graying hair pinned tightly and eyes sharp as pins. Sometimes Mabel left day-old biscuits in a paper sack at the back door, no words spoken, no favors asked. Sophie also knew Mr. Avery, the hardware clerk, tall and narrow, his gray mustache twitching when he spoke, his clothes always smelling faintly of oil. He had once pretended to throw out a pair of cracked canteens, leaving them where Sophie could see. His kindness was the kind that never announced itself, but mostly people avoided her. She was the poor Miller girl, the orphan who drifted at the edges of gatherings. Her father had died in a logging accident when she was 3, her mother in a car crash 2 years later. Foster families had taken her in, then sent her away when she didn't fit, when the weight of grief made her too quiet or too wild. Finally, she had stopped trying. With Bruno at her side, she had carved out a kind of half-life on the margins of Maple Hollow. That night, hunger gnawed louder than usual. Sophie pressed a hand to her stomach, willing it still. The barn creaked above, the rafters stiff with ice. Bruno lifted his head, ears twitching. He didn't growl. Instead, he stood and shook himself, his collar jingling softly. Sophie frowned. "What is it?" she whispered, voice hoarse from thirst. Bruno stepped closer, nudged her sleeve with his nose, then tugged gently. His eyes locked on hers, insistent. Sophie pulled her arm back. "It's freezing out there." He nudged again, harder this time. Then he turned toward the ladder, glanced back at her, and waited. Sophie hesitated. Bruno had done this before, not often, only when something called him. Once he had led her to a cardboard box near the railway bridge where a stray cat with 3 legs shivered. They had kept it safe for a night before it wandered off to someone else's mercy. Another time he had tugged her toward the back of the church, where kind Mrs. Larkin had been dropping a bag of apples by the steps. Each time, Bruno's strange sense had saved them from hunger or loneliness. Tonight his stare was unshakable, full of quiet urgency. Sophie pulled the threadbare scarf tighter around her neck, slung her patch backpack over her shoulder, and sighed. "All right, but if my toes freeze off, it's your fault." Bruno wagged his tail once, a solemn promise, then padded down the ladder with the sure footing of someone who had memorized every rung. Sophie followed, boots thumping softly on the wood. The barn door groaned open. Cold air rushed in like an ocean, stinging her cheeks, clawing at her lungs. Snowflakes swirled under the streetlight, each one sharp as glass. Sophie hunched deeper into her jacket. Bruno stepped into the drift, tested the ground, then glanced back at her as though to say, "Follow." They moved through Maple Hollow's sleeping streets, houses hunched in silence, their windows dark or glowing faintly with firelight. A porch creaked under the weight of snow. Sophie glimpsed Mabel's diner, its neon sign dead, but inside, a shadow moved. Mabel herself wiping counters, her hair tied in a knot. Sophie ducked behind a hedge, Bruno at her side. She wasn't afraid of Mabel, not really, but she had learned that pity could feel like a wound. They passed the schoolyard. The swing swayed slightly, pushed by the wind. Sophie slowed, staring at the empty playground. Once she might have been there, laughing, braids flying, friends tugging her arms. Now it was only a ghost of what might have been. She swallowed hard and walked on. Bruno's pace never wavered. He led with certainty, tail low but firm, ears pricked. His paws left clear prints in the snow, and Sophie stepped in them, as though his path made the world safer. The stars above were scattered sharp across the black sky, distant yet watchful. As they reached the edge of town, Sophie looked back. Maple Hollow lay small and dim behind her, a scattering of lights under the weight of night. Ahead stretched the hills, blanketed in snow, their trees bending under ice. The wind carried the scent of pine and something else, something she couldn't name, a promise or a warning. Bruno paused at a broken gate, pushed it open with his muzzle, and waited. Sophie squeezed through, snow crunching under her boots. Her breath came in quick bursts, white clouds in the dark. She touched Bruno's fur for courage. "Okay," she whispered, "lead the way." And with that, girl and dog stepped into the wilderness, leaving behind the fragile shelter of the barn and beginning the walk toward a secret waiting to be uncovered. The road out of Maple Hollow thinned into silence. Sophie trudged behind Bruno, each step an echo of his paw prints. Her boots crunched against the snow crust, and the wind needled through her scarf, but she kept her eyes fixed on the broad back of her companion. Bruno's tail swayed like a metronome, steady, certain. He was leading her somewhere, and the certainty in his movements pushed away the fear that might otherwise have clawed up her throat. They climbed toward the low ridge that overlooked the town. Sophie glanced back once and saw Maple Hollow scattered below, darkened homes, the church steeple pointing like a finger toward heaven, the schoolyard silent and buried in white. The town looked smaller than ever, like it belonged to someone else. And maybe it always had. Ahead, the trees grew thicker, branches stooped under ice. The path was little more than a deer trail, narrow and uncertain. But Bruno found his footing with ease. His coat shimmered dark against the pale snow, a moving flame of life in the frozen woods. He stopped occasionally to sniff the air, ears swiveling, before pressing forward again. Sophie trusted him. She always had. After nearly an hour of climbing, they came to a clearing. At its center crouched a cabin, shoulders hunched beneath decades of weather. This was the Dawson house, or so Sophie realized with a shiver. She had heard whispers of it in town, tales traded by children around schoolyard fences, about the Dawson family who had vanished one winter night, leaving their plates half full and their door ajar. Some said they had gone mad, others claimed they had walked into the hills and never returned. Adults dismissed it, but no one ever bought the property. The cabin stood like a scar against the snow. Its shutters dangled, crooked and splintered. The porch sagged as though tired of waiting. Window glass, where it remained, was fractured into spiderwebs of frost. The front door leaned off its hinges, gray with rot, but the snow at its base was disturbed. Someone had walked here recently. Bruno's hackles lifted. His body stiffened, yet his ears tilted forward, not back. Alert, but not afraid. He padded up the porch steps, wood groaning beneath his weight. Sophie hesitated, her stomach tight. The stories she'd heard rose in her memory like cold mist. But then she thought of the barn, the hunger, the thirst that clawed her insides. She thought of Bruno, who never turned her wrong. She followed. The air inside was stale, a mixture of dust, wood rot, and something sharper metal maybe, or the ghost of fire. Sophie pulled her scarf down and blinked as her eyes adjusted. The single room stretched wide, a shadowed shape of furniture long abandoned. A wooden table with one leg braced by a brick, 2 chairs slumped like drunks, a cabinet missing its door. Yet scattered across the floor were marks that didn't belong to time boot prints, faint but fresh, and the dark scuff of something dragged. Sophie's breath hitched. She crouched, fingers brushing the prints. Someone had been here not long ago. Bruno paced, his paws making no more sound than whispers. He sniffed the corners, tail low but steady, until he reached a spot near the hearth. There he stopped, pawed at the floorboards, then looked back at Sophie with a sharp, insistent bark. She knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the cold wood. "What is it?" she asked, though her voice trembled. Bruno scratched again, claws raking against the grain. The sound was hollow. Sophie pressed her hand flat and felt it, a vibration, the echo of empty space below. Her heart quickened. She dug at the seams with her fingernails, splinters biting her skin, until one board loosened. With effort, she pried it up. Beneath the plank was a shallow cavity lined with dirt and stone. Inside lay a metal box, rust clinging to its edges, its lid etched with scratches. Bruno whined softly, tail thumping once against the floor. Sophie dragged it out. The box was heavier than it looked, its weight making her arms strain. She set it on the table and tried the latch. It resisted, then gave way with a reluctant creak. Inside, the past had been preserved, papers yellowed but intact, rolled maps tied with twine, and notebooks smudged with graphite. Sophie's hands shook as she unrolled one map. Symbols danced across the page lines, shaded areas, and red marks that traced routes across the land. At the bottom, scrawled in hurried ink, she read, "Primary source, 40 feet down. Pure." Her mouth went dry, though she had no water left to swallow. She recognized enough to understand this was a map of the ground beneath Maple Hollow. The marks showed veins, channels, and at their end, a promise. Water. Bruno nudged her arm, his nose cold against her skin. She looked at him. His eyes glowed in the dim light, calm but intent, as if to say, "See, this is why we came." Sophie lifted another paper. It was a notebook page written in a firm hand. She read aloud, her voice low. "Survey complete. Aquifer confirmed. Must keep hidden until land secured." She frowned. Whoever had written this had known about the water years ago. Had they left it here to be forgotten? Or had they been silenced? The thought chilled her more than the wind outside. She shoved the papers back into the box, heart hammering. The town had been dying of thirst while this knowledge lay buried under a floorboard. Families rationed water. Children cried themselves to sleep with dry throats. And here was the answer. Bruno wagged his tail once, a deliberate gesture. His body seemed to ease, as though a burden had lifted from him too. He sat squarely, ears forward, watching her. She reached out and buried her fingers in his fur, feeling the steady warmth of him. "We found something," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Something big." The cabin creaked as though answering. The wind rattled the broken shutters, and somewhere far off, a branch cracked under ice. But Sophie barely noticed. She pressed her palm flat against the papers again, her mind racing with questions she could not yet answer. The morning after their discovery in the Dawson cabin, Sophie felt the weight of the metal box heavy against her back. She had tucked it carefully into her ragged pack, wrapping the brittle papers in a scarf to keep them from tearing. Snow still clung to the hills, but the sun had risen with a faint shimmer, and the cold was gentler, though hunger still pulled at her ribs. Bruno walked beside her, head high, tail steady, his amber eyes flicking off into the tree line as if danger hid in every shadow. Sophie knew where to go. She had one person in the town who had ever treated her like something more than a stray. Henry Thompson, the farmer who lived on the far edge of Maple Hollow, past the broken windmill and the frozen creek. Henry was in his 70s, a man carved by labor and weather. He was tall but bent slightly from years of carrying sacks of grain and bending over stubborn soil. His frame was wiry, his hands large and ridged with calluses. His face was narrow, cheekbones sharp, skin leathery from sun and wind. He wore a short white beard that framed his mouth, though his jawline still hinted at the strength he had in youth. His eyes were pale blue, clouded by age but still sharp enough to catch details most missed. People in Maple Hollow said Henry had once lost his wife and son in a spring flood 30 years ago, and from then on he lived quieter, slower, keeping mostly to himself. He had a reputation for honesty and for silence, which in a small town was rare enough to count as a virtue. Sophie had met him by accident months before, when she lingered too close to his chicken coop. Instead of shouting, Henry had simply appeared with a piece of bread in his weathered hand and said, "Every stomach deserves a chance." He hadn't pressed her for words, and she hadn't needed to explain. Since then, he had given her little things when she passed by, a biscuit, a jar of beans, sometimes only a nod. That was enough to plant trust. Now Sophie crossed the frozen path to his homestead. The farmhouse was modest, its paint peeled to gray, the porch steps sagging. Smoke curled thin from the chimney, promising warmth inside. Bruno paused at the gate, sniffing. His ears lifted, then angled back, catching some sound Sophie could not. He growled low in his throat. Sophie laid a hand on his head. "It's all right," she whispered. "It's Henry." Still, Bruno remained alert, his tail stiff. Sophie climbed the steps and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet yard. For a moment she wondered if Henry was away. Then the door opened slowly. Henry stood framed in the doorway. He wore wool trousers patched at the knees and a flannel shirt tucked loosely into his waistband. His shoulders stooped, but his presence was steady. "Well now," he said, his voice gravelly from age but not unkind. "If it isn't Sophie Miller." His eyes dropped to the dog at her side. "And your soldier here." "Bruno," Sophie said quickly, as if to remind the man the dog had a name. Henry nodded, gaze steady. "What brings you both out this far in the cold?" Sophie hesitated, then slid the pack from her shoulders. She clutched it tight for a moment, afraid the secret might vanish if she let it go. Then she opened it and drew out the rolled papers, laying them on his rough palm. Henry frowned, his lined forehead deepening. He shuffled back into the house, gesturing for her to follow. Sophie stepped in. The farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds. The living room was simple. 2 chairs, a small table stacked with old newspapers, shelves lined with jars of beans and potatoes. A single framed photograph of a woman and a young boy rested on the mantel, their smiles frozen in another lifetime. Henry carried the papers to the table, pulled his glasses from his pocket, and unfolded them carefully. His hands trembled, not from weakness but from something else, recognition. "Where did you find these?" His voice was tight. Sophie swallowed. "In the Dawson house." Under the floor, Henry stared at her, eyes sharp. "That cabin's been abandoned since before you were born. Folks said the Dawsons walked away one night and never came back. But this..." He spread the map wide, lines curved and crossed, geological symbols Sophie couldn't name, and bold ink marks that pointed northwest of town. "This is Dawson's work. I knew him. He was a surveyor, clever man. People thought he was a dreamer, chasing water under rock. Looks like he wasn't dreaming after all." His finger traced the red X. His voice lowered. "This could be it. An aquifer, maybe wide enough to feed all of Maple Hollow, enough to save us from ration lines and dried wells." Sophie's heart thudded. "So it's real? The water?" Henry nodded slowly. "Looks like it. And it explains a lot. Folks said Dawson's family vanished without a trace. I reckon they didn't vanish. Someone made them vanish." The words hung heavy between them. Sophie thought of the disturbed snow at the Dawson cabin, of the boot prints on the floor. She hugged her arms tight around herself. Henry folded the map carefully. "This is dangerous knowledge, Sophie. If the wrong men hear about this, they'll try to claim it for themselves. Maple Hollow's thirsty, and thirsty men grow mean." As if on cue, Bruno barked sharply. He had stationed himself at the doorway, ears high, his body taut, his eyes fixed on the road. A shadow passed beyond the gate, a man walking, wrapped in a long coat, hat pulled low. Sophie caught only a glimpse, but Bruno growled, a deep warning sound. Henry stepped to the window, pulled the curtain just enough to see. His jaw tightened. "That's no neighbor of mine. Could be someone keeping an eye out." He turned back, his gaze steady on Sophie. "Your dog's clever. He knows danger before we do." Sophie knelt, pressing her face against Bruno's neck. His fur was warm, steady. For the first time she felt the full truth. This secret was bigger than her, bigger than hunger or thirst. It was dangerous. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder. His palm was heavy, grounding. "You've stumbled onto something important, girl. And dangerous, too. But don't you doubt it. This could save Maple Hollow. You'll need courage, and you'll need to keep that dog close." Sophie looked up at him, eyes wide. She nodded. Bruno's growl faded, but his ears remained tilted toward the road, his body tense. Sophie followed his gaze, her chest tightening. She knew then. Someone had noticed them. The secret was no longer safe. The snow along Main Street had hardened into ridges of ice, crunching under wagon wheels and the boots of townsfolk who hurried with their heads down against the wind. Maple Hollow had learned to live with scarcity, but whispers traveled faster than water ever could. By the end of the week, nearly everyone knew that Sophie Miller, the ragged girl with the German Shepherd, was hiding something. Rumor reached ears that were always waiting Richard Collins. Richard was the wealthiest man in Maple Hollow, though his wealth came not from generosity but from opportunism. He stood in his mid-50s, tall and broad in the shoulders, a presence that filled every room whether welcome or not. His hair was silvering at the temples, combed back with meticulous care, while his mustache, thick and waxed, gave him a look of sharp authority. His eyes, pale gray, were cold as frosted glass and gave little away except calculation. His suits, tailored and always pressed, made him look like a man untouched by the dust and drought choking the town. Richard had earned his fortune buying up desperate farmers' land for pennies during dry years, promising help, but reselling at profit once conditions improved. The drought had made him richer, not poorer, and he wore that fortune like armor. Behind the charm he displayed at church socials and town meetings lay a man convinced that everything had a price and that he had the means to own it. For months he had suspected there was more beneath Maple Hollow's soil than parched rock. His own hired surveyors had brought him fragments of reports, hints of water, but never proof. When he heard that Sophie Miller, the child most dismissed in town, had been seen carrying strange papers and sneaking to Henry Thompson's farm, his suspicion hardened into certainty. If the girl truly held evidence of an underground source, he intended to seize it. Richard did not act alone. He employed men who owed him debts or feared him too much to refuse. Chief among them was Earl Dixon, a broad-chested man in his 40s with a scar running down his left cheek from a bar fight years back. Earl had thinning blonde hair cropped close, a permanent sneer, and hands like spades. He had once tried to farm, but a gambling debt had cost him his land, and Richard's money kept him fed now. Another was Frank Slim Wallace, thin as his name implied, with hollow cheeks, dark stubble, and a twitchy manner that made people uneasy. Slim had grown up in Maple Hollow, but left in disgrace after a theft gone wrong. Richard brought him back with the promise of coin and protection. Slim's wiry frame and quick hands made him useful for work others might hesitate to do. It was these two who shadowed Sophie one bitter afternoon. She had left Henry's farm with Bruno at her side, the weight of the metal box still pressing in her pack. Sophie tried to keep to the back lanes, but Maple Hollow was a small place, and secrets had a way of shrinking the ground. At the edge of the woods, near the old mill road, Earl and Slim stepped out from behind a fence. "Well, look here," Earl drawled, his scar tugging as he grinned. "The little Miller girl. Been carrying something heavy, haven't you?" Slim's eyes darted to the pack slung across Sophie's shoulder. "Boss wants a word with you. Best hand it over, sweetheart." His voice was thin and sharp, like a nail scratching glass. Sophie froze. Her heart thudded. She clutched the straps tighter. "I don't have anything." Earl chuckled, the sound low and mean. "No use lying. Folks seen you. Hand it over, and maybe we don't make this rough." Bruno stepped forward, fur bristling, a growl rolling from his chest. His teeth flashed white against the gray light. Slim took a nervous step back. "Dog's mean." "Dog's just a dog," Earl said, though he shifted his weight uneasily. He lunged forward, grabbing for Sophie's arm. Bruno exploded into motion. His bark shattered the cold air, sharp and furious. He leapt, jaws snapping, and caught Earl's coat sleeve. The fabric tore as Bruno yanked back with surprising strength, pulling the big man off balance. Earl cursed, stumbling into the snow. "Get him off!" Slim shouted, reaching clumsily for a stick from the roadside. Sophie didn't wait. "Run, Bruno!" she cried. The dog released Earl's sleeve and bounded back to Sophie's side. Together they darted into the woods, snow kicking up in flurries behind them. Branches whipped against Sophie's face as she ran, lungs burning from the cold. She clutched her pack tight, every instinct screaming that if they lost the papers, the town would lose its only hope. Behind her, Earl's shouts echoed through the trees, but Bruno's presence at her side kept her legs pumping. He barked twice, warning her when the path split, guiding her toward the thicker brush where their tracks might blur. They ran until Sophie's legs threatened to collapse. At last, they crouched behind a fallen log, gasping. Bruno pressed close, ears swiveling, growls vibrating low in his chest. Through the trees, Sophie caught sight of Slim stumbling into the clearing, muttering curses, while Earl's heavy steps crunched behind him. They searched, but Bruno's keen sense had led Sophie well. The men passed by without seeing them. Only when the woods fell quiet again did Sophie let herself breathe. She buried her face in Bruno's fur, tears stinging her eyes. "They want it," she whispered. "They'll never stop wanting it." Bruno licked her cheek, steady and grounding, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. In that moment, Sophie understood something that chilled her more than the winter air. Carrying the secret of the water wasn't just a burden. It was a target. She was hunted now. If she tried to tell the town, who would believe a ragged orphan? But if she kept it hidden, the wells would run dry, and Maple Hollow might die. The choice pressed down on her like the snow-laden branches overhead. For now, all she could do was hold on tighter to Bruno and the box in her pack, knowing both were lifelines in a storm of danger that had only just begun. The woods were quiet except for the crunch of ice breaking under Sophie's worn boots. She had wandered until her legs gave out, collapsing by a stream bed that had long since dried. Stones that once gleamed under running water now lay gray and lifeless, cracked like the parched hearts of Maple Hollow. Sophie hugged the metal box to her chest, the rolled map inside pressing hard against her ribs. The cold bit through her coat, but it was not the cold that made her shiver. Bruno lay down beside her, his heavy body warm against her thin frame. His thick black and tan coat was mottled with burrs from their flight through the woods. He pressed his head against her lap, amber eyes lifting to meet hers. They were steady, unwavering, filled with something Sophie barely dared to name faith. Tears streaked Sophie's cheeks. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. Her voice cracked, and the sound vanished into the brittle air. "If I keep this, people will keep suffering. But if I show them, who's going to believe me? I'm just a stray, just a nothing." Bruno gave a soft whine and nudged her arm, his nose cold against her skin. It was as if he were saying, "You are not alone." Sophie wiped her face with her sleeve. She thought of the nights she had gone to bed with her belly gnawing at itself, of the times she had stood outside the bakery only to be chased off as if she were a rat. And she thought of the children she had seen lining up with buckets at the town's well, only to be told there was nothing left to give. Maybe she was a nobody. But wasn't everyone in Maple Hollow being treated like nobodies too? Forgotten. Thirsty. Desperate. Sophie clenched the map. "We can't keep this secret," she murmured. "We have to tell someone who can make people listen." Her mind turned to the one figure in town who still carried respect. Clara Jenkins, the mayor of Maple Hollow. Clara was a woman in her early 50s, tall and straight-backed, with hair the color of iron streaked with white, tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her skin was pale, weathered slightly by years of Montana winters, and her green eyes missed little. Clara's face bore fine lines not only from age but from worry, the kind carved when someone carries the weight of other people's problems. She was known for her fairness, though also for her caution. She did not leap to judgment, nor did she chase after gossip. Some admired her measured ways. Others thought her too slow, too deliberate. But Sophie remembered that when the ration lines had grown too long last summer, it had been Clara who insisted every child get a cup before any adult. Sophie knew it would take all her courage to face the mayor. She rose, her knees stiff, brushing snow from her coat. Bruno stood beside her, tail swaying slowly, as though sensing the road ahead. By dusk, Sophie made her way into town. The streets of Maple Hollow glowed dimly with lanterns lit early against the falling night. Windows shut tight against the cold, and the air carried the tang of smoke and silence. Few people noticed the small girl climbing the steps of the town hall, the great wooden doors looming above her. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of ink and pine polish. The walls were lined with ledgers, notices tacked with neat handwriting. Sophie's heart pounded as she approached the office at the back, where a lamp burned low. Clara Jenkins looked up from her desk, spectacles perched on her nose. She wore a dark wool dress buttoned to the throat, and her hands, though slender, looked strong as they turned the pages of a ledger. Her eyes sharpened at the sight of Sophie. "Miss Miller," Clara said, her tone not unkind but cautious. "It's late. What brings you here?" Sophie hesitated, clutching the pack. Her voice wavered. I need to show you something important." Clara studied her a moment, perhaps weighing whether this was another childish plea for food or pity. Then her gaze shifted to Bruno. The dog stood tall at Sophie's side, chest broad, fur glinting in the lamplight. His ears stood erect, his eyes fixed steadily on the mare. Clara's brow furrowed, her lips pressing into a line. "Come closer," she said softly. Sophie stepped forward and placed the rolled map on the desk. Her hands trembled. "We found this in the Dawson house. It shows water, real water, enough for everyone." Clara lifted her spectacles and leaned over the map, her sharp eyes scanning the careful lines and inked marks. She read the notes, her lips tightening as she recognized the signature of the long-vanished surveyor. When she looked up, doubt lingered in her eyes. "Do you understand what you're saying, child?" Clara asked. "If this is true, it changes everything. But people will not take such news lightly. And you," she paused, her gaze softening just a fraction, "you are not someone the town easily listens to." Sophie's chest tightened. She had known it. No matter how true the map was, she was still the orphan on the edge of things. Before her courage broke entirely, Bruno stepped closer to the desk. He placed one heavy paw on the wood, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. It was a gesture that felt deliberate, as if he were presenting himself as witness. Clara's mouth parted slightly. She sat back in her chair, considering the dog, then the girl. The silence stretched long, filled only by the crackle of the lamp. At last, Clara said quietly, "This animal believes you." "Perhaps I should as well." Sophie's throat ached, but relief flooded her chest. She nodded quickly, eyes shining. Clara rolled the map carefully, tucking it into a folder. "This cannot be spoken of outside these walls, not yet. If Collins or others hear of it, they will try to seize it for themselves. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded again. Bruno gave a soft huff, as if in agreement. Clara rose from her desk, her tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "Then we will find out the truth. And if it is as you say, child, Maple Hollow may yet have hope." Sophie pressed her hand against Bruno's neck, drawing strength from his steady warmth. For the first time since finding the map, she felt she had passed some unseen test, not alone, but with Bruno standing as her silent, steadfast ally. Snow clung stubbornly to the rooftops of Maple Hollow, the streets turning into slick ribbons of ice as townsfolk shuffled toward the square. Word had spread faster than fire through dry brush. There was proof. Sophie could hardly believe it herself. Only hours earlier, Bruno had pawed restlessly at the frozen ground near the Dawson cabin, his claws tearing at the hard soil, until he unearthed something unexpected. A leather-bound journal, edges cracked, its cover darkened with years of dust. Inside, the pages belonged to James Dawson, the surveyor who had vanished decades ago with his family. His careful handwriting filled the book with notes about soil depth, water tables, and underground rivers. But what struck Sophie and Clara most were the entries at the back dated in the same year Dawson disappeared, naming Richard Collins directly. Dawson had written of meetings where Collins demanded silence about the aquifer, promising him the profit if he cooperated. When Dawson refused, the entries stopped abruptly. Clara Jenkins wasted no time. She gathered the council members and ordered the bell to ring, summoning the town. For the first time in years, Sophie found herself not skulking at the edges, but walking side by side with the mayor, the map and the journal bundled in Clara's arms. Bruno walked ahead, ears pricked, each step purposeful, as if he knew this was the day everything would change. By mid-morning, the square was packed. Men with weather-creased faces, women wrapped in shawls patched against the cold, children clutching empty water pails, all stood shoulder to shoulder. The desperation in their eyes glimmered now with something sharper: anticipation. At the center of the crowd stood Richard Collins, summoned by Clara's word. He had not refused. His arrogance was too great to hide, but he carried himself like a man certain of his power. His gray coat was trimmed with fur, his silver watch glinting at his pocket. Beside him loitered Earl Dixon and Slim Wallace, their eyes darting nervously, though Collins remained calm, his pale gaze sweeping the crowd as if measuring each person's worth. Clara stepped forward, tall and firm, her voice carrying across the square. People of Maple Hollow, we gather because truth long buried has clawed its way back to light. She raised Dawson's journal high. This book was written by James Dawson himself, the man who surveyed these lands before he vanished. And in it, he recorded the existence of an aquifer water enough to save us all. A ripple of gasps spread. Men exchanged glances, women clutched their children tighter. Clara's tone hardened. He also wrote the name of the man who sought to keep it hidden: Richard Collins. The crowd turned as one. Collins lifted his chin. "Lies!" he barked, his voice deep and commanding. "The word of a vanished dreamer and a half-wild girl? And you'd take it as gospel?" Sophie felt her knees weaken as dozens of eyes shifted to her. She stood small, her coat frayed, hair tangled, but Bruno pressed against her leg, steady as a stone. His presence gave her courage she hadn't known she carried. Clara handed the journal to a council member, Samuel Harris, a barrel-chested man in his 60s with a full beard gone white. Samuel's reputation in town was for fairness. He had worked as a blacksmith for 40 years, and his voice carried weight. He flipped through the pages slowly, then looked at the crowd. "It's Dawson's hand," he confirmed. "I knew the man. This is his work. And his warning." The crowd erupted. Angry shouts rose above the bitter wind. "He let us starve! Our children went thirsty while he lined his pockets." Richard's mask of calm cracked. His jaw tightened, and his hand twitched toward his pocket as though tempted to draw steel. He forced a smile instead, stepping onto the platform. "Listen to yourselves," he said. "You're ready to condemn me on scribbles in a moldy book? I've built this town's prosperity. I've kept trade alive when others would let it die. Without me, Maple Hollow would be nothing but dust." But the crowd no longer looked at him with admiration. They looked with fury. Richard saw it too late. With a sudden move, he shoved past the council, breaking into a run. His boots clattered across the boards of the platform, and he lunged toward the open street. Earl and Slim scrambled after him, but the crowd was slow to react, shock freezing them in place. Not Bruno. The German shepherd launched forward, a blur of black and tan against the snow. His paws struck hard, muscles driving him like an arrow. He intercepted Richard at the edge of the square, leaping high. His jaws caught the sleeve of Richard's fine coat, dragging him off balance. Collins tumbled to the ground, the crowd gasping as Bruno stood over him, teeth bared, growl thunderous. "Get him off!" Richard shouted, flailing, but he dared not strike the dog. His pale eyes widened as men surged forward from the crowd. Samuel Harris and two ranch hands yanked Richard to his feet, pinning his arms. Earl and Slim tried to push through, but townsfolk held them back, their debts to Collins suddenly worth less than the water he had stolen. Clara strode forward, her face like carved stone. "Richard Collins," she declared, "you will answer before this council for theft, deceit, and for condemning our people to suffering while hoarding the truth for your own gain." The crowd roared its approval. Some shouted curses, others wept openly, relief and rage mingling in equal measure. Sophie stood still at the heart of it, hardly able to breathe. For the first time in her life, every eye turned to her, not with pity or disdain, but with gratitude. She felt their gazes heavy and real, and she realized that she was no longer invisible. She had been the messenger, the keeper of truth. And because of that, Maple Hollow had found its voice. Bruno returned to her side, tail wagging slowly, his amber eyes soft. Sophie bent and pressed her face into his fur. "We did it," she whispered. In that moment, for the first time, she believed it. The square of Maple Hollow still carried the echoes of shouts and fury from the day Richard Collins had been dragged down before the council. Yet, as the sun dipped behind the snow-draped ridges and night crept over the valley, something far stronger than anger pulsed through the townsfolk. Hope. The proof was in their hands: the surveyor's map, Dawson's journal, the confessions of Richard's greed. Clara Jenkins wasted no time. Under her steady command, lanterns were lit, tools were gathered, and the people of Maple Hollow marched out beneath the stars toward the site marked with the red X. Sophie walked among them, clutching Bruno's thick fur as if afraid she might wake from a dream. The dig began at once. Men swung shovels, shoulders straining. Women carried buckets, and children huddled by the lantern glow, wide-eyed. The night was pierced with the rhythm of picks striking frozen soil, the grunts of effort, and the whisper of prayers. Sophie worked too, her thin hands blistering but determined. Bruno stayed close, pacing the edges, barking sharply whenever someone faltered, as though urging them on. Hours passed. Doubt began to creep in, mutters rising. What if Dawson had been wrong? What if they were digging only holes in the dark? Sophie's heart sank each time the shovel hit nothing but dry stone. She leaned against Bruno, her tears frozen before they could fall. Then, just before dawn, a cry erupted. Matthew Carter, a young rancher barely 20, tall and broad-shouldered with sandy hair and calloused hands, struck something damp. He dropped to his knees, scooping at the soil with frantic fingers. Moisture seeped into his palms. "Water!" he shouted. The crowd surged forward, more shovels tore at the ground, and within moments a thin stream bubbled up, darkening the earth. Then a gush burst forth, clear and cold, spraying into the air like a fountain of salvation. Voices broke into cheers and sobs. Mothers lifted children to let them cup handfuls of the blessed water. Old men fell to their knees, faces shining with tears. Clara Jenkins herself stood tall, her usually stern face softened with awe. "By God," she whispered, "we are saved." Sophie stumbled forward, dropping to her knees at the edge of the spring. She dipped her trembling hands into the stream, bringing the cool liquid to her lips. It was sweeter than anything she had ever tasted. Bruno plunged his muzzle into the water, drinking deeply, then lifted his head, droplets sparkling from his whiskers, his eyes glowing with contentment. Sophie hugged his neck, burying her face in his fur. For the first time in months, Maple Hollow's laughter filled the night. Songs were sung, prayers offered. Lanterns burned until the horizon blushed with dawn. The town had been reborn. Days turned into weeks, and the well grew deeper, its flow steady. Wooden troughs were built, barrels filled, gardens replanted. Life returned to Maple Hollow. Crops sprouted green against the thawing fields, and children ran again with rosy cheeks and wet hair. The square, once haunted by despair, now rang with hammers building, laughter rising. Sophie no longer walked invisible along the edges. Neighbors called her name, offered her food, and smiled when they passed. She was no longer the stray. She was Sophie Miller, the girl who had brought water and life back to the town. Henry Thompson, the old farmer with his bent frame and white beard, came to her one evening. His voice was rough but kind. "You and that dog of yours deserve better than an old barn or cold streets." And so, the townsfolk raised a cabin. It was small, built from pine logs with a sloped roof to shed the heavy Montana snows, but to Sophie, it gleamed brighter than any palace. Windows let in the morning light, and a stone hearth warmed the nights. They placed it on a patch of land beside Henry's farm, so she would never be alone again. The day Sophie stepped inside, she stood frozen at the doorway, unable to believe it was real. The scent of fresh-cut wood filled her lungs. A quilt lay folded on a bed, its stitches neat, sewn by hands that cared. Bruno trotted around, nails clicking on the floor, tail wagging furiously as if he understood this was their home. He barked once, loud and triumphant, as if declaring it to the hills. Neighbors came by with gifts, jars of preserves, loaves of bread, blankets. Clara herself brought a basket of apples, setting it on the table with a rare smile. "This is yours now," she said firmly. "You've given us life, Sophie. Let us give you a home." Sophie could only nod, tears burning her eyes. That evening, as the sun melted into gold across the snowy ridges, Sophie sat on the porch steps with Bruno at her side. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing. The well in the town square glimmered, its bucket ropes creaking as fresh water was drawn. The nightmare of thirst was over. Sophie looked at Bruno, her voice soft but sure. "We saved them, didn't we?" Bruno wagged his tail, eyes bright, and let out a bark that echoed across the valley, proud and full, as if to say yes. And for the first time, Sophie felt something she had never dared to believe in: belonging. In the coldest winter, a homeless girl and her loyal German shepherd uncovered the miracle that saved an entire town. Some call it luck, but I believe it was God's hand guiding them through the darkness. Just like Sophie, sometimes we are forgotten. Sometimes life feels empty, but God can use even the smallest, weakest soul to bring light and water to the thirsty. If this story touched your heart, share it, so others may feel the miracle too. Comment Amen if you believe God still works wonders through the most unlikely people. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these stories of hope and redemption. May the Lord bless you and your family with peace, health, and love.